political knowledge in society and the relationships with media consumption and access. So I'm going to turn this session over to all of our presenters, first to the team at the University of Bern.
So thank you so much for introducing. I'm just sharing my screen here. And I hope you can all see it. Okay, perfect. I get a nod. So welcome from Switzerland. Good morning to the US. Good afternoon here. I'm very delighted to present our research project in this panel. As we heard in the introduction, the project on forced academic migration during the NS period has sort of 4 parts. It includes biographical studies. It includes the role of aid organization versus personal networks. It includes a close look on Switzerland and the Swiss university landscape. And sort of an umbrella over all of this is our digital approach, which helps us, first of all, it's a tool to structure and store our data. As well, we use it for analysis and visualization, and I will talk about this part in my talk, and then Stephanie and Sinja will present their parts of the project. But before I start, thank you very much to Abby also for organizing this and this tremendous work she has put into it, and I think we're going to have a great conference. So I don't think I have to talk much about the historical context, but this huge wave of emigration of academics from Germany was obviously a result of the implementation of the law for the restoration of the professional civil service in April 1933, where civil servants of non-Aryan descent were to be retired. There were later revisions of this law, so more and more people lost their jobs in Germany. So this sort of started this whole wave of migration. In our project, we have 3 main objectives. We are interested in the way academic network changed due to the expulsion of academics from German university and then later also from Austrian universities and in occupied Europe during the 1930s and 40s in respect to geographical, institutional, and personal changes. Second, we are interested in the impact of forced migration on individual academic biographies. And third, on the position of Swiss universities in the changing academic landscape. Because despite Switzerland being a neighboring country to Germany and being sort of a desired exile country for many academics, we'll hear about this later, there has been no sort of comparative study on the role of Switzerland and Swiss universities in that time frame until today. Our goals are first to store the data of scientists who lost their jobs during the Nazi era in order to illustrate global academic migration, to track shifts in global academic networks, in order also to track shifting scientific centers. We all know that the reputation of many German university and research institutions dropped due to this expulsion, and some other centers were rising up. So we, thanks to our database, we will be able to sort of track these shifting centers. And we're also interested, obviously, in the transfer of knowledge. We also store the data of scientists at Swiss universities, not only people migrating to Switzerland, but also the professors who have been already there, in order to see changes in the Swiss academic landscapes. And there the question arises, do we see a nationalization during the 1930s and 40s of Swiss universities, or on the contrary, an internationalization due to maybe immigration? And then we also store the data of rescue organizations in order to study the role of academic help organizations in forced academic migration, and the role of personal networks vis-a-vis institutionalized networks. So this sort of, oftentimes this is overlapping these personal and scientific networks, and we try to bring this on a map. So far, we have almost 6,000 persons in our database. This is has happened, I believe, last week. We imported large numbers of data. The data is based on first unpublished archival sources. We have, like many researchers worldwide, been hit by the pandemic, so we couldn't travel as much as we could. So we are very much relying on data from Switzerland right now. Also, obviously, unpublished list of expelled scholars. You can see one here, and then also secondary literature. And we have a two-leveled procedure. So we use systematic data ingestions via GND, and then we are in the second step enriching this data sort of by hand. And this is a lot of work. Just a few words about our data model. We are working with nodegoat, which allows us to build, or allowed us to build, a data set on our data model. And it offers relational modes of analysis with spatial and chronological forms of contextualization. By combining these elements within one environment, this nodegoat, we are able to instantly process, analyze, and visualize complex data sets relationally, diachronically, and spatially. In nodegoat, we could define our own data models, model freely and dynamically with no limitation to relational structures or depth. This model allows for filtering and analysis of complex relational networks between objects and in our data set. Each object is supplemented with geographical and temporal attributes, making diachronic, geographic, and social visualization of our data set directly available. We have it organized. I hope you can see my cursor. So sort of the first part of these types is where we store our data, which we then later work with for analysis. And the second part is really sort of where we store our archival data. So it's sort of it's interlinked, but we don't use this for our analysis. So I'm not sure how well you can see that on the screen, but one of our main types is where we store all the personal data, sort of the obvious things, name and academic fields. We also have like a tag, the degree of Jewishness, which is obviously a very problematic category, but we just need it for our research. And then we have some sub-objects attached to it, just to get as much biographical data in the database as possible. Then a second rather important aspect is the type career. In this type, we store every career move of a person, and this makes the data, putting in the data so very so it's such a lot of work, because this obviously cannot be imported automatically. This is actually, people have to enter all this data. But it does help us to track individual careers, and then in a later stage start to make comparisons and see, like on a macro level, like bigger changes. Within the data model, we also have the possibility to add persons who played a role in somebody else's career. So someone is hiring someone is making sure that someone loses a job, someone is maybe giving financial support. So we have all these options to add in our database, and this later helps us also to study networks, who were important figures, which people show up over and over again. And this enables us to look beyond just institutionalized networks and see if there were certain players who played a larger role in many people's careers. Before I come to a conclusion, we also store, obviously, legal entities, university research institutions. They're always connected. They always have a geographical attribute, which then helps us to visualize migration and on the map. So, but before I come to a close, I want to give you one first example. I picked out Berta Ottenstein. You can see her here. She was a German-Jewish dermatologist who held 2 PhDs, one in chemistry from 1913 and one in medicine from 1919, both from the University of Nuremberg, as well as a habilitation in dermatology from the year 1931 from the University of Freiburg, Germany. She was the first woman in Freiburg and the first woman in dermatology to earn this highest academic qualification, which was and still is required in many European universities to conduct self-contained university teaching and to obtain a professorship. After her dismissal in 1933 from the University of Freiburg, she actually sued against it but lost. She first migrated to Hungary, then to Turkey, and after 1945, after the war ended, to the US. As a dermatologist, she was very well respected, and she was a groundbreaking researcher, but as a woman, she had to overcome many obstacles. She was never appointed full professor, for instance, and as a Jew, she was expelled and discriminated against in her own country, in Germany. But without her professional network, which was based on her scientific excellence, as well as on her ability to build friendships in all the many places she lived and worked, she would not have been able to continue her career in exile. And this is what you can see here, are all her sort of career moves. In Germany, she really moved, she was working in many different universities, and then to Hungary, Turkey, and then to the US. And after the war, she was actually appointed professor extraordinaria in Germany without actually getting a proper job. So she just got the title, but not a job, which is something we can see often. But you can see here are her, it's a very simple visualization of her moves. And there will be further research into her networks once all the data has been entered. And with this, I say thank you and pass it on to my team. And I stop the sharing. Yes. Okay.
Oh, Sinja, you're muted. So are you trying to introduce us?
No, actually, I just share a PowerPoint, but it would be Dean to share it.
Mm-hmm.
So, and it will say everything, I hope. Thank you very much for the invitation to this conference, and thank you, Stephanie, for this introduction to our research project. My presentation will give an insight into my current research, as I focus on aid organizations for academics and their impact on refugee scholars. This will also be the subject in the following minutes. I'd like to give you an overview of different aid initiatives, and then we'll go more into detail about one type of aid organization and demonstrate how I use nodegoat for my current research. As you may know, there were countless initiatives, relief organizations, and organizations that took care of refugees from Nazi Germany. Many of them addressed a specific group of people. There were, of course, aid organizations for Jews and for socialists, but also for academics. I will concentrate on the organizations, institutions, or initiatives that were specifically dedicated to the concerns of academics from the 1930s onwards. One goal of my research is to create an overview of all the assistance and support options available to academics. For this, I am collecting information about these initiatives in archives and in existing literature and save them in nodegoat. And here you can see an excerpt from our database. As you can see here, we have 617 legal entities, and from this are more than 40 already aid organizations for academic refugees. But this is not at all the organizations that existed. Now, you may ask me why such an overview is desirable. From my perspective, only such an overview makes it possible to explore collaboration as well as the structure and ultimately the impact of these support initiatives for dismissed and refugee scholars. As I store the information in nodegoat, it is possible to work with more data and to share it also with future research projects. In my research, I will then choose a couple of aid associations for case studies to elaborate their modus operandi in more detail. The amount of different support options for academics has already led researchers like Simone Lessig and Laura Leff to propose categorizations. On the basis of these two approaches, I adopted a known system for initiatives that were specialized in academics. I named them foundations, institutions, and aid associations. On this world map in nodegoat, you can see where aid initiatives existed and to which of my categories they belong. So you see here green and yellow for aid associations and institution, and then here we have different aid associations but also foundations in blue and institutions in yellow. This represents only the status of my research, and there are no aid associations in Latin America or Asia displayed because I did not make any research until today about these regions. It becomes clear that if different initiatives existed in Europe and America. However, the largest group of initiatives are the aid associations, which are represented by the green nodes. So all these ones and here also. Many of these aid associations have not been investigated in depth until yet. This is one of the reasons why I will focus on this category in my research as well as in the following part of my presentation. As foundations like the Rockefeller primarily finance positions at universities or research institutions, aid associations instead provided different kind of help. These associations were founded by a group of concerned people to help dismissed scholars from Germany and Austria and elsewhere. On the one hand, emigrated German scholars built up self-help organizations. A good example, therefore, is the Emergency Community for German Scholars Abroad. In German, it is Notgemeinschaft für deutsche Wissenschaftler im Ausland, which is represented by this node. And it moved later on to London. Therefore, we see here this green line. On the other hand, scientists and interested people abroad founded aid societies for German and later Austrian scholars at risk. The most famous is probably the Academic Assistance Council, later named the Society for Protection of Science and Learning, which was based in London and is here or here. No, in this big green node, and it exists until today under the name of CARA. Different academic societies, like the American Philosophical Association, formed also committees on exiled scholars. This means that not all associations supported academics in general, but some were specialized in professions or academic fields. Briefly summarized, the aid provided by the associations was the following: searching for potential positions at universities and other research institutions, help to emigration or flight with visas, tickets, etc., occasional funding of living costs in the country of arrival, trying to get funding for academic positions, and communication between different aid organizations and agencies as well with authorities. Now we look again on the world map and filter only for the aid associations because this is my focus now. I think if we have a look on the development during time, we see interesting patterns which probably would not be as striking when only working with traditional historical methods. So I go back on the timeline into 1933 in the end of 1932, and then please observe what happens if we go to 1933. So we are in 1932, and then we are in 1933. Numerous aid associations were formed immediately after the decree on the restoration of professional civil service in 1933. Thus, the dismissal of numerous scientists triggered immediate reactions, at least in Europe. As I noted in the beginning, the responses in the US and Canada were also numerous, but we can see now that this is not true for 1933 and 1934, according to my status of research, of course. If I move the timeline now towards 1938, 1939, and the 40s, we can observe that also many aid associations pop up on the world map in the US and even in Canada. Foundations instead, if we just have them, existed already in the US a long time ago, and they only existed in the US. What is visible too is that new aid associations emerged throughout the whole period, but with a clear peak in 1933. This finding is particularly interesting to me since recent research on the importance of professional networks of emigrated academics emphasizes that the early emigres were central to the subsequent academics. This visualization shows the development of aid associations, but of course it opens also a field of new questions. Apparently, the law of the restoration of the civil service activated people in Europe to form associations. What was then the activating moment in the US or elsewhere? And in which sense influenced the time of foundation the kind of help provided to scholars? And of course, in which way did they work together, and what was the role of institutions and foundations in this network? Now, towards the end of my presentation, I give you one example of one possible approach to answer the question of how aid associations worked and how I am trying to investigate the networks of aid. Many of the aid associations maintained lists of at-risk academics. Probably the famous list was maintained by the Academic Assistance Council, or AAC. Their list from 1936-37 lists over 2,500 names. However, not only the AAC created such a list, but also smaller organizations as the Emergency Committee in Aid of Displaced Foreign Physicians and Medical Scientists, or the before already mentioned Notgemeinschaft did it. These lists helped the associations in gaining an overview of all scholars at risk, and as such, they were working tools for support measures, for example, to find positions abroad or financing. My goal is to import all the names and lists of aid associations for academics into nodegoat. This will allow me, or I hope at least it will allow me, to compare how the lists were composed, who was on which list, or if the lists were even shared among aid associations. Last week, the data for the first lists were important, and I would like to show you a first compilation. So what we can see here is a social visualization of scholars and lists. The lists themselves are represented by these white dots. This is the list of the Notgemeinschaft in Zurich. This one is from the Emergency Committee in the US, and this one is from the AAC in London. The smaller notes, which are colored, represent people on the list. So they are colored according to the list they belong. Blue, the Notgemeinschaft, red, the Emergency Committee, and yellow, the AAC. You can see at a glance that some academics appear on more than one list. So we have here the blue and red notes, which appear on the Notgemeinschaft and the Emergency Committee list. And here the few yellow-red notes, which are on the Emergency Committee and the AAC list. What surprised me was that the list of the American Emergency Committee shows similarities with the list of the British AAC here, but also with the Swiss and later on British list of the Notgemeinschaft, but the two European associations have no names in common so far. If one will know something of a specific person, you can type in the name here, as, for example, Paul Tillich. And then if you choose him here, you can see he is on the list, and he's on both of the lists. And of course, you can just go on these notes, and then you see people, and then you have also more information about them. For me, this compilation is a first indication that 8 associations were in contact to each other. Probably they used similar lists or exchanged information and names. Apparently, these contacts were not limited to Europe. In contrary, it seems that the exchange with the US was important. Then I will sum up. Shortly after the enactment of the law for the restoration of the professional civil service in 1933, 8 associations were formed, first and foremost in Europe, but also in the US. The building of 8 associations in the early 30s seems to be a more European pattern. In the US and Canada, this development came somewhat later, but fits then in the European pattern too. However, the important funding institutions like the Rockefeller Foundation were already existing in the US for years. According to the analysis of the list from different 8 associations, which I showed you on the last slide, I suppose that they communicated together across borders between Europe and the US. This may be due to the fact that academics who migrated at an early stage probably sought refuge in Europe first, and from there traveled on voluntarily or were forced to do so to the US, or, for example. To shed light on the mechanisms and successful or unsuccessful assistance for refugee scholars, we have to look on connections and networks across countries and continents. And this will be underlined by the following presentation of Stephanie Salzberg. Thank you very much. So thank you for attending. Okay, good.
Thank you very much, Sinia, and good morning and welcome also from my side. And of course, many thanks to everyone involved in organizing this exciting conference. I would like to begin today's presentation, Patterns of Multiple Migration of Jewish Academics and the Case of Alexandra Weinstein, with a quote from a letter from the British aid organization Academic Assistance Council to Alexandra Weinstein, written in June 1935 after Weinstein had sought their support. I cite, "The Council feels that as you are a Swiss subject, the Swiss authorities in the university world in Switzerland have a certain responsibility for your future. The Council feels convinced that the authorities will recognize their responsibility to you in the sudden emergency caused by the events in Germany, and that your position is therefore slightly easier than those of the German scientists for whom there is no possibility of returning to their own country." Alexandra Weinstein a Jewish Swiss mathematician who had been dismissed from his university post in Germany in 1933, was repeatedly told by academic aid organizations that, in view of the large number of refugee scholars to be looked after, they could not actually provide any more aid to Swiss citizens for whom Switzerland had to care. Weinstein, however, finally ended up in the US. This raises the question, which is also the topic of my PhD project, of how Switzerland and especially Swiss universities had dealt with academic migrants, whether Swiss or non-Swiss, and how the Swiss universities had positioned themselves in this, as the High Commission for Refugees called it, crisis of academia. In today's presentation, the question will be addressed as to whether, and if so, to what extent and under what conditions scholars dismissed in Germany were employed at a Swiss university after 1933. Particular interest lies in the background of those Jewish academics whose path ultimately led to the US. The focus will be on the application of nodegoat and how this digital tool can be used for the study and research of large amounts of data. The second part of my presentation focuses on cases of multiple migration, and thirdly, the multi-layered case of Alexandra Weinstein is presented. A case that not only sheds light on the situation of academic migrants in Switzerland, but that also provides information about crucial factors of multiple migration and, finally, about the conditions and opportunities for refugee scholars in the United States. The study is based on files from different Swiss archives. And furthermore, I would like to thank the Bodleian Libraries in Oxford, the New York University Archives, and the Rockefeller Archive Center for digitized files. In Switzerland, the prevailing discourse of the so-called infiltration by foreigners and anti-Semitic resentments inside the federal authorities, as well as within the police for foreigners, had a direct impact on the way refugees were dealt with. Immigration was restricted and eventually almost completely prevented. The decision on who was appointed to the universities, though, was not the responsibility of the federal authorities, with the exception of the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology, ETH, but of the cantonal governments. In this context, due to this cantonal autonomy, the universities held a special position. As Switzerland was an obvious immigration destination, Swiss university members and the respective cantonal directors of education had received numerous personal visits and letters from academics who were hoping to take up teaching or research activities in Switzerland. Finally, it was decided to reject the requests in general. Exceptions should only be made if the cases fulfilled the internal criteria of, I cite, great urgency. While these requests mostly were put out into the blue, Swiss universities also had to fill chairs that had become vacant or had been newly created. This, of course, raises the question of the extent to which refugee scholars were considered as potential candidates and whether, respectively, how many appointments actually took place. So first, I filter for those scientists who had lost their position in Germany due to National Socialist laws, for example, the law for the restoration of the professional civil service. And I include also scholars who had to resign under pressure from National Socialists, as well as those who left their position because they had rejected the NS regime. To find out how many of these individuals had obtained a position at a Swiss university, I add a so-called reduction filter. So I add like the number of time and the kind of legal entity and the host country. So as things stand at the moment, there are 30 people who lost their job due to National Socialism and then got a permanent or temporary job at a Swiss university. To get a better overview, it is possible to group these scholars and display it graphically. The easiest way to do so is to just export the required data to Excel. Here are some examples for illustration purposes, for example, the distribution of religious affiliation, also in connection with nationality and whether who had received a permanent and who a temporary position, or also a graph about the represented disciplines. Some of these scholars remained in Switzerland until the end of the war or long after. Others, who had only received temporary employment, were forced to migrate once again. How many of them ended up in the US can again be shown with the help of another filter. So time and host country US. So we see then that at things stand, it leaves for people. All of them had lost their jobs in Germany because of the so-called Aryan paragraph, then had a temporary position in Switzerland, among other places, and finally migrated to the US. We can also visualize their career paths. It shows that the first person among them goes to the US in 1938. The others follow in 1940 and 41. We also see that some of them were also in the same places. For example, Free had a temporary position at the University of Geneva, Free at Cambridge. In the following, I will present the case of one of them, and it's the one of Alexandra Weinstein. Alexandra Weinstein was born in 1897 in Saratov, Russia. Her Jewish family soon migrated to Germany, where he studied mathematics in Göttingen. After the beginning of World War I, Weinstein moved to Zurich, Switzerland, where he studied, did his PhD and habilitated. In 1925, his application for naturalization was granted and he became a Swiss citizen. After research stays in Leipzig, Rome, and Hamburg, funded in part by the Rockefeller Foundation, he started working at the University of Breslau as a private lecturer. In the spring of 1933, he was in active exchange with Albert Einstein, who wanted to bring him to Berlin as a fellow researcher. However, the negotiations were interrupted by political events and Weinstein was dismissed in 1933. With the support of French and British aid agencies, he was able to continue his research in Paris, London, and Cambridge, and also to give guest lectures at other universities. At the same time, he also tried to obtain teaching positions at Swiss universities, as the chance of obtaining a permanent position in Switzerland was, because he was a Swiss citizen, considered to be the highest. As the archival data suggests so far, Weinstein had applied for a position at 5 of the 8 Swiss universities, but only received a temporary deputy position in 1935 at the University of Geneva. Officially, his requests and applications were rejected on the grounds that there was no need for a teaching position in mathematics or the financial situation would not allow it. However, if not officially stated, anti-Semitic and protectionist reasoning played an important part in the rejections of his applications. For example, in Basel, the majority of the faculty rejected Weinstein's request. On the one hand, because a chair that was soon to be established would be filled by a lecturer from their own ranks, and no possible competitive situation should be created. On the other hand, reference was also made to a letter from an influential member of the Mathematical Association of Switzerland and PhD supervisor of Weinstein, who strongly opposed the hiring of Weinstein. In addition, it was repeatedly emphasized that more young Swiss academics should be promoted, which in turn shows that people like Weinstein, who had become Swiss citizens through naturalization, were often not classified as the real Swiss. That Weinstein also perceived this to be the prevailing standpoint becomes evident from a letter he wrote to the AAC after he was rejected as a candidate for positions at the University of Geneva Neuchâtel in 1936, even though he was a highly regarded candidate there as well. He wrote in a side, "I see now plainly that there is no chance for me left in Switzerland. I am here only a Jewish foreigner, whereas abroad I'm considered to be Swiss. Having waited so long here, I am completely at a loss on what to do. Anyhow, a further stay in Switzerland is useless." Weinstein had already inquired about possible positions in the US. I cite, "By making use of personal connections, I have got there with some prominent scientists." but he subsequently went to France, where important representatives of his research field in Paris supported the advancement of his career. There he obtained a second doctorate and was able to continue his research until Germany's invasion of France in 1940. The Weinsteins did not return to Switzerland, but they were able to flee to Portugal. From there, they managed to get to the U.S. On a regular immigration visa on the Russian quota. Certainly the many letters of recommendation from former colleagues and well-known mathematicians who were already living in the US were also decisive for this result. These contacts were also indispensable for finding a position at an American, or in his case, a Canadian university. In July 1941, more than a half year after his arrival, he received a temporary position as a lecturer at the University of Toronto. This was mainly due to the interventions and contacts of Richard Courant, a well-known German mathematician who had already emigrated to the US in the early 1930s and with whom Weinstein had been acquainted since the 1920s. In Toronto, Weinstein was first promoted to assistant professor and, in 1945, to associate professor. 2 years later, he finally obtained a position as a full professor at the University of Maryland, a position he would most certainly not have obtained in Switzerland. So to make it short, on the one hand, digital tools help to process a large amount of data and sort it according to specific criteria. On the other hand, individual cases can also be detected and studied in detail. But above all, and this will be the main focus in the further expansion of our database, personal and academic networks can be studied as well as their influence on patterns of multiple migration of refugee scholars. Thank you very much for your attention, and I am looking forward to the following presentations.
Okay, we're going to switch papers now. Professor Leff and Professor Weinstein, Rediscovering Refugee Scholars. I'm going to turn it over to them. Same here, dear.
Professor Leff, we're not hearing you. How about, John, could you speak and please see if we can hear you?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes, hold on 1 second. Professor Leff, could you please check that on the 3 dots on the ellipsis icon on the far right at the bottom of the screen, could you click that and click settings and double check your microphone settings, please? You may need to just reset default on the microphone to reset it. And I hate to do this, but it's also been suggested that maybe if you exit and come back in, you might regain your microphone. I've also, Professor Leff, I've also requested that someone from Accelerants come help us with this. So she should be here shortly.
While we're waiting, I don't know, John, if you want to start, or if anybody has any pressing questions for the first paper, we can give everybody a little bit of time. to work through our technical concerns.
Still nothing, Professor Leff, sorry.
Professor Leff, this is Janelle with the Follow-ins. I hate to ask you to do this, but if you wouldn't mind just stepping outside of the workshop and then coming back in, that perhaps may resolve the issue. Thank you.
So while we're waiting, feel free to use the Q&A chat on the side to kind of pose some questions to the first panel team. Hopefully we will get this paper going in just 1 second.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay,
Thank
great.
you.
All right.
Sorry about that, everyone. So, Johnny, you're going to get up the PowerPoint now?
Sure.
I'll
Sure thing.
and thank you. Sorry about the sound issue. Thank you to the FDR Library and particularly Abby Gondek for planning the conference and this panel. So there is our project, John and mine, is called Rediscovering Refugee Scholars. And there is an absolutely humongous literature on what has come to be called the intellectual migration, the movement of European scholars who were fired during the Nazi era from their academic positions for being of Jewish descent. And as here are just a few of the books on this topic. I mean, there are many more books. And if you look at scholarly articles, it gets, it's just voluminous. It's hard to even get track of all of the material. And it's obvious why this subject has got such scholarly appeal. First of all, it's about us, right? It's about scholars. And particularly in the first decades after World War II, it was literally by us as well. Many of the people who migrated wrote memoirs. They taught students who began looking at this area. And since then, it's just exploded even more. And just to, I think you got a little bit of the historical framing from the previous presentation, but just to give you a sense of how early this began to happen in the Nazi regime, Hitler became chancellor in January of 1933, and in fewer than 3 months, you had the law for the restoration of the civil service and the beginning of the firing of academics from their position. So this is really a 12-year period because it begins very early in the Nazi regime. For all of its volume, however, there are still significant gaps in the literature. It tends to focus on those who managed to escape to the United States or Great Britain or other places of refuge, not those that didn't. So that's already a significant bias in the literature. It tends to focus on people who were or would become famous. So certainly, people who went to the tops of their fields influenced the academic trajectory in whatever country they were in. Those tend to be the ones who are most studied. It also tends to be triumphalist, meaning that in addition to sort of being the discussion of who escaped, there's also laudits given to the universities, the countries who rescued and saved these people. And so it tends to be a sort of a feel-good story. That I think has been tempered somewhat in recent years, but certainly that was an immediate thrust. But mostly it tends to be anecdotal. Based upon individual cases or individual disciplines, as opposed to an overall approach. And it is that problem that John and I hope to address in our Rediscovering Refugee Scholars Project. And I'm delighted that scholars in Switzerland and other places are also taking this up so that we don't have to be stuck with individual stories, but can have some overview based on data. I'm going to tell you just a little bit about how John and I came to this project. As scholars, we usually find the archives that will illuminate the issues we're studying, but every now and then the archives find us. And that's really what happened for me in this case. I was examining how professionals, doctors, lawyers, journalists, responded to requests from their colleagues in Europe to help them escape. or to get jobs in the United States. And I came across the papers of the Emergency Committee in Aid of Displaced Foreign Scholars in the New York Public Library. And just one little quick note based on the earlier presentations, there was a subset of the Emergency Committee in Aid of Displaced Foreign Scholars. It actually started as German scholars and then became foreign scholars as the problem was not limited to Germany or to Germany and Austria. And the subgroup was called the Emergency Committee in Aid of Displaced Medical Academics. That was because there were so many medical academics and they seemed to have their own kind of issues that the Emergency Committee decided to form a subgroup, but they are different. And one important way in which they're different is that the Emergency Committee in Aid of Displaced Foreign Scholars, the umbrella organization, did not have a list. In fact, they didn't believe in having a list for reasons we could talk about later. The medical academics did, so that's just a little bit of a note on that. But the Emergency Committee in Aid of Displaced Foreign Scholars was the main American group dedicated to helping European scholars immigrate and find work in American institutions. And as I poked around through that, the papers looking for journalists who might have immigrated to teach in journalism schools, I realized that the collection had a bigger story to tell. And that resulted in my book, which I think John has. Oops, go back. There it is. There's my book. But with the help of my more data and digitally driven colleagues, such as John, I realized there was an even a bigger story than that. The emergency collection, now we can take a look at their finding aid, John, has folders of over 6,000 scholars who tried to immigrate to the United States. And most are a treasure trove of data. The European scholars did what any one of us would have done had we wanted a university position, which is they sent to the committee their CVs. And the CVs, here's the finding aid. And you could see over to the left where we have the grantees and non-grantees. But anyway, this is the finding aid. So they sent their CVs, which had their ages, their genders, their birthplaces, their degree earned, from where and when, where they taught and when, why they were fired, often their marital status and religious oriented background. They also contain memos and letters documenting who was trying to help them, who rebuffed them, and the responses of American institutions. So from this information, we could begin to draw a clearer picture of who wanted to leave, who did, who wasn't able to, and perhaps even some of the reasons why. Now, there's a number of difficulties. First and foremost, the Emergency Committee collection is not digitized. All of those CVs and memos and letters are on literally crumbling pieces of paper in the New York Public Library's beautifully restored building on 42nd Street. We tried, and we'll probably try again, to get the public library to digitize the contents, but so far they haven't been receptive to that. We then decided to do a more limited pilot project, focusing on female scholars. And we chose female scholars because it was more manageable. A subgroup, there were about 400 scholars in the collection of about 6,000. And that was apparent from the names on the folders. I mean, we had to do a couple of double checks on names like Prenay, but for the most part, you could tell the gender from their names on the folders. And even the 400 seemed to be too large. So we decided to narrow it further by looking only at women who are in the sciences or in math. And we did that through a combination of Googling their names to find out their disciplines, and then in some cases just going into the folders and finding out if they were in that discipline. And then John and I spent a few days taking photos with our iPhones of the contents of all the female scholars folders. And one of them was this woman, Hedwig Cohen. You see her here in her lab at the University of Breslau. And just to give you a little bit of flavor for what the documents were like, we can move to the next one, John. So this is her letter with some of her background that we could, took pictures of and then could distill the information from that. We had a group of graduate students in public history working with us on this. And then the next photo too, the next slide too. That's also part of the CV. If you could see it better, you could see what the information was there. The next slide is of her publications. Oh, that's the end of and those are the list of all of her publications. And this was the kind of data we wanted to put into the database. So now I'm going to turn it over to John, and he can show you a little bit of what we did with this information in terms of developing a pilot project. And one thing I wanted to add is that in addition to, and John will talk about this more, but in addition to collecting the data, we also wanted to have, as part of it and as an important part of it, a public-facing website that would appeal not just to the scholars, but to anyone who wanted to see how the story could be told. So now I will turn it over to John.
Thanks, Laurel. Very grateful to be here and very excited to see all of this this sort of commonality and sort of mutual scholarship on these issues. It's really heartening to see people on the other side of the ocean doing the same thing and doing it really wonderfully. So we had interests in digital storytelling and networks and computer science, and really what we wanted to do is sort of organize a bunch of different projects around Laurel scholarship. And so this is not my sort of domain of expertise, but I got interested in the problems of digital storytelling here. So what we did was, based on the archival research, spin up a website and then actually create an entire new application, which I'll show in a minute, which tries to combine timeline storytelling and geographical or GIS storytelling. So that was so we took the project in sort of a unique direction, but that is consistent with kind of what Northeastern is about as an institution. So here you'll see just sort of like the website is still kind of a work in progress, and actually a couple links broke, so I need to fix those, but I'll kind of walk you through some of the things that we did. So, I mean, this actually looks similar to some of the other teams. We created a small, in some ways, kind of like pilot database, which records the 80 women, 80 or so women that we found who were in science or science adjacent or STEM adjacent fields, and began to pouring over their CVs and their memos, try to categorize them and sort of their position. I think, Laurel, if I'm not incorrect, only 3 of the 80 actually were grantees. So it became very much— the
number of grantees to non-grantees, it was about 300 and something overall, not just women. And I think we found like 6 women and 3 in the sciences.
In the sciences, okay. And so we as a sort of matter of public storytelling, we immediately recognized that the women were significantly disadvantaged in this sort of almost competition for becoming a grantee. And so we kind of framed it as a kind of rediscovery process, or a process of kind of bringing their stories back to light, and people got very interested in this. There's obviously a great degree of interest in women in science generally, and some of the problems of gender discrimination in our contemporary world. And so this is really, I think, an intriguing area for a lot of people. We try to categorize their fields of expertise within the sciences or within STEM, and there's a lot of diversity. I mean, everything from astronomy to zoology, disciplines that were sort of quantitative social science like economics were there, even law we included, but that was an interesting problem, actually, just to categorize which precise disciplines they were in. Let me just show the team, and then I'll show a little bit about the tool that we created. So you can't quite see everybody's bios here, but I want to give a lot of credit to Michelle Borgen, who's a computer scientist and a good friend of mine and Laurel's, and she and her team participated very actively in this, and it was a really fruitful collaboration, which we hope to continue. And so now I will move to the tool that we created. And so the problem that we identified from a digital storytelling perspective was precisely that, trying to show sort of change over time in terms of geographical location and then time there were no off-the-shelf products. I know nodegoat is there, and there's other sort of digital humanities tools, but we weren't entirely satisfied that we could tell the stories in a compelling way. So we created our own, and credit to a couple doctoral students of Michelle's, Adetea and Misha Schwab, who coded a lot of this. So I'm going to play the 1-minute video, and Laurel, feel free to chime in and we can talk over this. But this shows the application that we created, and what we decided to do is tell the story of 2 women. Laurel, do you want to chime in?
Yeah, so the women you saw at the beginning, one was Leonore Brescher, she was a biologist. The other one was Hilda Geringer, who was a mathematician. Leonore was from Vienna, although she worked in various labs in Germany as well. She was fired from her position in Kiel in 1933. Hilda Geringer was at the University of Berlin. She was fired as well in 1933. And why it says divergent paths is that the 2 women do go in different directions. So Hilda Geringer goes to a number of places, including Turkey, where she is for a while, and finally she does land in the United States with a position at Bryn Mawr. Leonore Brescher is not so lucky. She is in Vienna. She's working for the Institute of Biological Studies there, and she tries desperately to get out and ultimately is not able to, and is machine gunned at Malý in Belarus in 1942.
This tool actually is also sort of still under construction, but once it's sort of fully up and running, what you will see, and I'm actually going to pause this so I can go to the next slide, is really a kind of hybrid tool. And we think for public history and digital humanities, it's sort of an interesting example of scholarship sort of driving some innovation, getting the computer science folks excited. And we think there's a lot of promise in this project. When we first sort of unveiled the very pilot, website and storytelling tool, people really got interested very quickly, and suddenly Smithsonian Magazine was calling Laurel, and we thought, we really have something exciting here. So many of these stories are just so compelling, and I hope we could, just seeing the other scholarship in this workshop, find ways to collaborate. With that, Laurel, I don't know if looks like we're about 17 minutes. So do you want to add some final remarks?
I guess the last thing I would just say would be on the final point, which is, one of the things that appealed to me about doing a database of the emergency committee was it was self-contained. There were, lots of files, so didn't feel like we were looking at just a slice of the problem. But it was very clear that the scholars didn't look at it like, I'm going to the United States or I'm going to Great Britain, I'm going to take the help of the Academic Assistance Council, or I'm going to get the help of the Emergence Committee. It was they bombarded everyone they knew, every organization. And so I think one of the important things is if we can pull together a database, it'd be like everything, it be looking at the Society for the Protection and Learning files and whatever there are in Swiss university archives, and I mean, it's a massive undertaking, obviously, which is what makes it kind of daunting. But on the other hand, I think we could get such vital information from doing that, and really have, and this is John's field and interest, but really have a sense of what the networks were. I mean, what it took to actually be able to get a position outside of Germany or Austria, and in safety, and particularly, and I was really happy to see this on the other team's slides, but the idea, because it just anecdotally to me from looking at these folders, it seemed to me that in many cases there was one person in the United States, when we're talking about immigration to the United States, who just took this on, devoted mostly himself, a few herselfs, to this project, and were able to actually not just save careers, not just save the academic information for posterity, but literally save people's lives. So being able to find those individuals, see what they could do. And then, the other part of it too, which is always an important part for me, is who didn't help, who rebuffed people, who weren't willing to hire anyone, or were for their resources only willing to take on a few people, and then under very limited circumstances. So the more we're able to tell that story and then to apply it to our current time. I mean, it's interesting, the Academic Assistance Council is still going on in a different name. So is the Emergency Committee in Aid of Displaced Foreign Scholars, continuing under a different name. So that points to the fact the problem has not gone away, and any insights we can contribute to current debates from looking at this incredibly intense period, I think would be helpful. So that's it. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you to Professor Leff and Professor Wibby, and to all the researchers on our first team. I want to give everybody a minute to get their questions into the Q&A section. And I want to take, we do have one question in there, but I want to take the opportunity to ask a question on my own, and maybe draw some points out from both papers. And there's two things that really stood out to me, other than just how mutually beneficial the research is, and how much there's overlap in terms of the content and the theme. But there's two things I was hoping that maybe all of you or some of you could reflect on. One is the kind of importance in collaboration in doing this kind of work, and how working either with people in different fields, slightly different expertise, maybe shifts or changes or shapes the kinds of questions that you're asking through this work. And then the second question I had, I really appreciate how well all of you walked us through the data that you're using in this work, and the ways in which the data can become digital and organized. And I'd like for anyone to really also reflect a bit more on the potential. I think Laurel really set us up at the end for what is the potential if we can work with more data. But I'm curious also about the ethical challenges and the gaps that come with making these historical materials into clean, organized data. And I don't mean to kind of direct this only to Professor Maurer, but I did notice on your slides, one of the options on your spreadsheet was Jewish, and then under Jewish, there were several different categorizations. And it struck me, is that your categorization? Was that from the data? How are we thinking about the application of categorization that might have been given by the Nazis or by the Nazi period to contemporary questions, and how you think about that, or how you approach that? So that was maybe a lot of things all at once, but if anyone wants to jump in with those thoughts, that'd be great.
Well, I could jump in really quickly on that. It's uncomfortable to include that kind of information, but it's absolutely essential. One of the things I found in just doing Well Worth Saving, which is not quantitative at all, but one thing that seemed to me to be really important in American universities judging these scholars was whether they were too Jewish, not just Jewish, but too Jewish, which meant maybe you had some Jewish ancestry, but you were now a Catholic or you were a Protestant. It also often had to do with how you looked, how you spoke. And so it wasn't just you claim yourself to be a Jew, but where you fit in this bizarre Nazi way of thinking about things, but that also carried over to the United States. I mean, there were some universities that said, I mean, most of them said they wanted someone who wasn't too Jewish, but there were also some that said, we want Aryans. And they used that language and they said it out in their letters. And, you know, if we don't capture that, we're not capturing the era.
Yeah, if I just may jump in here, we do use the contemporary, the historical categories. So we're using full Jew, half Jew, quarter Jew, father, mother, just in order to depict the realities of the time. These are historical categories, and we need to address this when we start to publish the data, and also when we also obviously writing articles and the PhD students also books. But I think in order to actually study the movement at the time in the 30s and the 40s, we have to work with the terms as problematic as they are, and being aware of the problematic aspects of them.
John, maybe you want to take on Rachel's first question about sort of approaching this as not this being your main area of interest and working with PhDs in physics and a computer science professor.
Sure. Rachel, could you just reiterate your question?
Yeah, I think this is probably something that many of the panels at this conference can address, but it strikes me that the collaborative approach to both sets of work is really vital, not only to working with the data and making it understandable, but also just changing the questions that can be asked for a project by bringing together multiple ways of thinking and working. And I guess I'm most curious about how those kinds of collaborations ultimately shape the research and the direction of the overall project in terms of like knowledge making and understanding.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's clear from the prior team that they have many of the interdisciplinary skills all in one, they're and able to pull off some things that I think as individuals we were not. So we had to, it was necessary to go partner with the computer science department and partner with some other folks in order to pull off the project. But I think what's interesting is that it kind of got everyone interested in the subject. So Michelle Borgen, who herself is a young Jewish woman scientist, had, I wish you were here to talk about it, but was quite inspired actually by doing some of this research that she would not normally do. So she had a whole personal interest in the subject, and I think was creatively kind of stimulated by what Laurel and I were bringing to her, and her graduate students who are interested in coding new kinds of storytelling applications saw a new problem. Basically, how do we create a hybrid tool that would allow us to do sort of timeline and story mapping together? And so what's interesting is that the new questions arise as you try to do some of this archival work, and as the data themselves sort of present problems for presentation and for organization. And I think it's really generative.
Stephanie or Sinja, do you want to jump in at all? Any thoughts on doing your PhD work in this kind of collaborative environment?
Yeah, maybe some words. I was very glad because we had like 2 workshops with the guys who like running nodegoat. So this was really important because I'm not like, I haven't studied informatics or something. So it is really helpful to have someone who like explains it to you. But you also have to use, or you need some time to really get it so you can make some visualizations. But I think while doing this visualization, it also helps to like think about your research questions. Not only what can you show, but what would you like to show? And yeah, and you get also new questions, which arises from like doing these visualizations, which I think is really, yeah, inspiring to get along with my PhD project.
If I can add something, because I remember on one of the workshops with the guys from nodegoat, we asked them, so we want to show this or that, and how can we manage to show them? And they told us, no, you will not show something you already know, but nodegoat will show you something you do not know yet. So they just skilled us in using data to show us new information and not just put in information and then visualize them. So that was really interesting for me to change the view on archival material too.
Yeah.
Yeah, and if I just quickly add, I'm also not coming from digital humanities. I'm a historian. I dealt with migration and biographies and cultural history. And when I was developing this project, I had this vision that we should have a shared database, and it would be great to do all these sort of things, to visualize, to do analysis with data. And there is a group of researchers at the University of Bern, and this group is growing and growing, who is working with nodegoat. So there is like a whole community now and doing quite different projects, also on quite different levels, really. We are maybe one of the largest, but there's another one dealing with question of academic migration in the Middle Ages. These are completely different questions, but I think it's very enriching also to be completely out of your field and sort of epoch to work with people. And it is a learning journey. We're all always learning, and yeah, we're not finished yet.
Yeah, thank you all. I do want to add the question we got in the Q&A, which is back to the content of all of your papers. Were artists and musicians forced to migrate in the same way as scholars, and has anyone tracked their journeys? Which I guess is a good question back to the data. Do any of the data sets that you all work with also track artists and musicians? Were they using the same organizational networks to find roots as scholars and academics?
I can answer that quickly, at least with the emergency committee, or at least the American piece of the migration, which was that the emergency committee was really formed to have people get academic jobs in the United States. And part of the reason for that, I mean, some of it was just those were the people who were fired, and it was sort of the earliest wave of persecution, but it was also because under the American immigration laws, people who were going to practice the vocation of being a professor in the United States were subject to got a non-quota visa. So they had a whole other way of emigrating, and that was very important in the way the people who formed the committee thought about it. So it therefore, and the State Department interpreted the provision in the law to say you had to have a job at an American university and a job offer. So if someone was a music professor or was an artist, could get a job at an American university, then the committee would help them, but not for other reasons. Although I have to say, these categories are all, kind of aren't really strict. And so there certainly are lots of letters and things that come in from people who have more of an artistic background than necessarily just a scholarly one.
Okay, thank you all very much. I'm going to turn things back over to Abby, who's going to wrap up the panel. But I'm really excited by all of the presentations, and thank you all so much. And I hope that this conversation can continue in other means. Thank you. Abby, are you there? Well, if Abby were here, I think she would also add her thank you to everyone on the panel, and let you all know that there are a number of more workshops to join today. You can see all of the additional events and workshops and papers that you can attend on the side panel. And we really appreciate everyone who's been able to attend. I think Abby's trying to jump back in.
Yeah, Abby seems to be having technical issues.
Yeah, it happens.
Yes.
But thank you to everybody who's come to the panel. And we are everyone at the FDR Library and Archives who's spent so long putting this conference together is really looking forward to the ongoing and fruitful partnerships and relationships that can be built through these conversations.
I think one last thing that Abby would have mentioned is we do have a networking hub that takes place at noon today. Those are for one-on-one networking sessions to meet other people who are involved with the conference. And we encourage, and thank you all for attending today. Thank you for your excellent presentations. We do have other sessions for the rest of the week. We hope you'll be able to attend those. Thank you all very much.